Welcome to Board on the Floor. I'm Chris. Early Sunday morning, I wanted to kind of go through the newer horror themed board games I've gotten my hands on since last year. It's actually not that many, though a lot have come and gone, but these are the ones that I've decided to keep or are the most recent. So, in my last video, I talked a bit about Night Cage, The Lost Ones, and Darker, Darkest as being some games that kind of I ended up picking up last week. Um, but the other few that I have here, Final Hour as well. But the other ones I have here have been ones that since last October I've managed to get my hands on or have kind of like also kind of moved up on the list. Last year I did a top 10 best horror themed board games for the solo player. And out of all of these, I would say they work quite well solo, except for my father's work. But that is one of the most interesting thematic games in regards to like horror themed board games that I have. And I'll explain why in a little bit. But to start off, I'm just going to talk a bit about Final Hour. I've only played it a few times, but in regards to an Arkham horror game, especially one of the smaller box games, so this is the exact same size as Elder Sign and the original Arkham horror card game. But the new Arkham horror card game, the revised edition, is a bigger box, more like Marvel Champions. Final Hour is still the same size as Elder Sign. And for a little box game, I say thematically, what you get in this box can deliver the same type of feel as the bigger boxed Arkham Horror or Eldritch Horror. I think it's a lighter game, it's a faster game, but it's got an interesting setup in regards to like this is kind of like what happens right after, I think it's Arkham Horror 2nd edition. So you're at the university, monsters are coming, and you have to kind of gather clues to be able to stop it all from happening. Monsters move around the board, and it's easy, very easy to teach, and I would say very engaging to play, but doesn't give the same type of mental challenge as something like Arkham Horror 2nd edition, 3rd edition, or Eldritch Horror. A fun little game, very reasonably priced, gives you the same vibes as the bigger box games within the Arkham Horror series, so worth adding to your collection. And going to another game that I play a lot with my family, Terra. I had done a video about this last year, but someone had lent me the actual game, so I managed to find a copy of it because it was out of print for a while. The other one that I had borrowed had all the expansions and the little minis. This is just the core game. But to get what you need to get out of this game, the core game is more than enough. It's a tile placement game, horror themed. You're stuck underground trying to find your way out of a cave. For what it actually is, it's very thematic and tense. And I've played it multiple times with my family. My kids love asking me to bring it out. And often someone has to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And it just so happens that many times Abby is the one who is just a little too far that we can't save her without running out the clock kind of thing. But tile exploration, asymmetrical characters that you get to play. The doctor is able to heal more than once. The bodyguard has way more health points. So a lot of clever mechanics in a very straightforward and simple game, but totally worthwhile. And I would say one of my favorite games right now, I'd say it's still in my top 10, and that is Subterra. Now, there's still some games here that I haven't had a chance to play because I literally got them last week. But even though I just got Night Cage, this was the first one I got to the table because I've been watching a lot of videos and reading a lot about this one. And this is more of a puzzler. So tile placement, exploration. You got to play 4 characters at once. So if you're doing this solo, you got to play all 4 of them. If you're doing multiplayer, 2 or 4 players. Doing the odd number of players makes it a bit more awkward. And I think it can go up to 5 players if you flip the board on the other side. There's enough space to get 5 players up there. Concept is really interesting, and mechanically, you can only see every tile that is adjacent to you. So if 4 people are on the board, they get to only see the tiles that are adjacent to them. But as you get closer, of course, then the tiles that are adjacent to you can stay lit even if you move away because someone else is near you. But each time you move, tiles disappear. And the whole point is trying to discover keys and gates. And it's possible that as you're going along, you discover keys too early or gates too early, and you kind of paint yourself into a corner and you won't actually be able to win the game or survive. because monsters also come out, and there's a few kind of like expansions within the box. This is the Kickstarter edition, so it has some extra monsters in there and some larger tiles to kind of complicate things even more. But same thing as Terra, very easy to teach and very quick games. So worth having in a collection if you like lighter games that get to the table faster. Now, one of the bigger boxes here, Maximum Apocalypse has been out for a while. It's got kind of a trashy B-movie vibe, but of course, that's great if you're into those types of things and into those types of stories. Many different monsters come in the core box, and in the Legendary Edition, you kind of have every monster imaginable. You can fight kaiju, zombies, giant bugs from outer space, robots, and so a lot of game within this box. And even in the core box, which comes in around $50, there's multiple different characters you could pick and multiple different enemies you can fight. So depending on which monsters you pick, you have easy, medium, and hard levels. And each one has a different map that you would set up and different intentions or quests that you have to accomplish to complete the scenario. I find that every time I set it up, I get something different out of it, because you can go for something lighter, you could go for something harder. It has a lot of possibilities and is a very straightforward game too. It's not too hard. You have decks of cards that you could add kind of equipment to or different weapons to. And so it has elements of a deck builder, though I wouldn't really refer to it as that. I would say at its core it's kind of a dungeon crawler, but very thematic and tons of fun. You could get a lot of people involved because it is 1 to 6 players, I believe. Yeah. And short games, they don't have to be too long depending on which level of difficulty you want to pick. So that is Maximum Apocalypse. And as I was saying before, kind of the only one that doesn't really work so well solo is my father's work. But this is one hell of a game. It has an app, like a companion app that you have to use, but that is just for the story itself. Because as you go along, it remembers certain things and it kind of changes the direction that the story is taking. But this is kind of a worker placement, resource building game. So it's really interesting to see a horror-themed kind of Euro game that somehow has a narrative to it. At its core, you're just trying to gather knowledge to perform your experiments, but sometimes you don't have enough time to do that. So you're gathering knowledge for the next generation. This game takes place over 3 generations of the same family, and the choices you make each generation and the knowledge you gathered gets moved on to the next generation. And depending on if you've done good things or bad things, it could affect what comes next. And all of that is kind of like controlled through the app. Lately, I've been having a harder time playing some of these app-based games, but this is the first one where I felt like the app wasn't getting in the way of the actual board game. It was just adding to it. So I feel like Tainted Grail has a companion app that also kind of does that for you, where it allows you to control the storybook through the app itself. So it doesn't get in the way of kind of like the gameplay and actually playing a board game as opposed to a computer game. But my father's work, I would say, is thematically probably the best out of the bunch. It really sucked me in, and it felt like I was living or playing out kind of like an old Hammer horror movie. So that is my father's work. Now on this side, The Lost Ones. This is a game that I wasn't aware that it was a horror game when I bought it, but I had picked it up because I had read about it and thought it'd be interesting to play with my kids. But when I was looking at the top 100 horror games on BGG, this is tagged as horror. So out of all of these, I think Lost Ones and Dark, Darker, Darkest are the only 2 I haven't played yet. But it's another one of those kind of like exploration games. You're flipping tiles, and I think there's a storybook that goes with it as well in a fantasy world, hopefully a dark fantasy world, which is why it has the horror label to it. But what I'd read about it online made me curious, because I do really like these kind of like exploration games. So I'm a big fan of flipping map tiles and seeing which kind of story elements connect to each map tile. So something similar to, say, Tainted Grail or Seventh Continent. It felt a bit lighter, and which is why I picked it up to try and play with my kids, but it does say it's 14 plus. I do play a few games with my kids that are meant for an older crowd, but they are fine with it. We are currently playing Last Friday. That's another game that I forgot to bring down here because it's set up on the table upstairs and we're in chapter 3 and I didn't want to disturb it. But Last Friday is another game that was added to my collection recently, and not solo whatsoever, has to have multiplayer, 2 or more people going. Weird at odd numbers because you have to have 5 campers on the board and 1 maniac. But anyways, that's taken away from talking about Lost Ones. I have the rule book upstairs on my bedside table, but I haven't had enough time to spend with it to tell you more about it. But just to say, I'm very interested in getting this one to the table and trying to play it with my kids. This is probably one of the oldest games out of the bunch. Darkest, I think, is the oldest game. But Legendary Encounters, alien deck building game. There's a lot of Legendary Encounters out there, so you could get ones that are, there's a Big Trouble in Little China one, there's a DC one, a Marvel one. I think there's also a Firefly one, or a Predator. There's even a Predator one, and I had read that you could somehow pair these two together. But in regards to alien games that are out there, I have the Fate of the Nostromo, which I've done a video on, and I'll link to right here. I used to have Nemesis, but it just didn't really click with me. And Nemesis, as much as it's not an alien game, it is pretty much an alien game. But out of all the ones that I've played over the last little while, this is the one that I felt was the most interesting because it allows you to play the movies and play out each one of the movies because it has different kind of like story decks that go up. And you, of course, can play different characters from any of the movies and mix and match and all that stuff. And I just found it was so immersive and interesting to be able to involve yourself in the development of the plot of each of these movies. It was very exciting for me. And I felt like it totally allowed me to rediscover different aspects of the alien world and be a part of it. And so in order to get everything for the game, there's the base box and then the Aliens expansion. And then there's even a Alien Covenant expansion, which is probably the more recent one that has come out. And that's the only one I don't have. But even just in the core box, you actually do have the different movies in the core box. It's just if you get the Aliens expansion, then you get the Queen board and all this other stuff. But this is probably the most immersive experience for people who love Alien and the universe that is created within all of those movies. Now, if we're going to be in space and experiencing horrors and strange phenomenons while we explore planets, Unsettled is probably the most entertaining game here in regards to its storytelling. It's got a great sense of humor, and it's gross, and it's over the top at times. And if you are a huge fan of horror and sci-fi, this game is pretty much built for you. It's a co-op game, which means that you actually have to work together. And if you are going to play it solo, you got to do it two-handed. You have to have 2 characters going out there. I've played it solo. I played it with my wife and my brother-in-law. And every time it's been a really enjoyable experience because the storytelling and the sense of humor is at the forefront of this game. But it also has a really interesting puzzle. This is kind of like a base framework. And then it comes with 2 planets you can explore. And there's extra planets you could get your hands on that are expansions. And each planet has different storylines. Like I think there's 3 tasks that contain 8 different elements of quests and things you have to accomplish in order to complete the planet. And so depending on your approach to solve this puzzle that is presented to you, there's a lot of possibilities and a lot of replayability. You have your basic core abilities, but each time you play it, there's the possibility of selecting unique abilities for each of your characters. And as you go through the gameplay, if you start to lose trust in each other, certain tiles get flipped over or covered, and it changes how you have to start thinking about playing while there's less trust amongst the team. So it's got some really interesting mechanics. And like I was saying, the storytelling is top notch and it's got a great sense of humor. It's harder to catch your hands on, sadly. I know they just did a second Kickstarter with some more planets. I've seen tons of copies going up used in the Facebook Marketplace and on BGG. So it is possible to get your hands on. It's a bit pricier, but I think there's a lot going on in this box to make it worth it, especially if you like sci-fi horror. And then our last game here is going to be Darkest. Now, this is one too that I haven't had a chance to play, but it's also out of print, so it's hard to get your hands on, but that does mean that usually there's a lot of used copies floating around. One thing I did hear about this game is that the rulebook sucks, but there is an updated rulebook on BGG, and I'll put a link down below. I had read that this was originally designed to be a Resident Evil board game, but then they either lost the rights or they didn't manage to get the rights. So they kind of rebranded it, though it does have supposedly a lot of similar elements to the Resident Evil board games that are out there, and maybe even does some of it better. I can't say just yet because I haven't had a chance to play it, but if you do look on the site, it has some similar artwork to the original Resident Evil. But this is a kind of dungeon crawler survival board game where you run, fight, escape. So thematically, obviously, if you're into more deeper horror, you got your zombies, you got your aliens, you got any monster imaginable over here. More kind of like psychological horror. You have Terra, Night Cage. I would say fantasy horror, Lost Ones, sci-fi horror, Unsettled, and then straightforward Lovecraftian horror, Final Hour. There's probably a game here for every type of board gamer. And out of the bunch, I would say my top picks, Unsettled, Legendary Encounters, Alien, Terra, and my father's work. They all have different strengths and weaknesses, I guess. But if I was doing a new top 10 board games for horror, now if it was solo, my father's work would be out of there. But just a regular top 10 horror board games for this year, Unsettled, Legendary Encounters, Terra, and my father's work would be on that list. I'm going to do my best to try and get some gameplay videos or reviews up for each of these in the next few weeks. Since it is October, I want to keep it kind of horror related. But it might spread out into November and December. Like, why not, right? It's not a big deal. As people are moving towards Christmas, maybe we could keep the focus on horror by, getting more and more of these videos up to distract from all of that holiday cheer. Keep checking back for those videos. And if there's any specific games you want to see me play, please put it in the comments below. And if you have any questions, you can put them down there too. But thanks for sticking around. Hope you enjoyed yourself, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.